No one can be taught to be a writer, Paul Engel said. What a workshop could do, he believed, was to establish an environment where creative writing was the central activity, where young writers could mix both with their peers and with established professionals. The best we can hope for, Paul Engel told me, is to save a young writer some time, to bring him along a bit faster than he might progress alone. Perhaps the breadth of the workshop's success comes from the modesty of its ambition and the clarity of Paul Engel's vision.
Paul was rather bigger than life. He spotted talent quickly and talked about it. He raised money for writers and talked about it. He spoke of the great poets he knew. He went to battle during those times when university miserliness or disregard threatened the workshop, and he thanked the university publicly whenever it came through. He did not often speak of his own writing, though he continued to add to his bibliography. Having been welcomed to the literary world with considerable fanfare, his first collection of poetry, Worn Earth, won the Yale Younger Poets Prize for 1932, and his second book, American Song, was greeted by a front-page review in the Sunday New York Times book section, written by the estimable J. Donald Adams. He nonetheless soon turned to carving out a wider place for writers within academia. Thereafter, his writing may have been taken somewhat for granted by himself and by others. The dynamic of the literary world, which today devours and moves on, even then tended to set aside the writing of those who labor publicly.
Both fiction and poetry workshops were directed by Paul Engel, who had not founded them but was largely responsible for their success. It had once been expected that he'd become a fine, perhaps a great poet. This hadn't occurred. As a fellow student once said, if Paul had a choice between two ways to do a thing, a simple, straightforward way and a complicated, difficult, underhanded way that was nearly as effective, he would always take the latter. A related predilection, I think, ruined his writing. Again and again, a poem would broach a real and moving subject only to collapse into sentimentality or hot air. That same predilection, however, made him a superb administrator.
I'd arrived in the dead of winter with few warm clothes. My overcoat was an uncle's GI overcoat which did not fit. Paul asked if I might have any use for a winter suit and took me out to Friendly Avenue to try on one of his that he claimed to have outworn. It was still a fine suit, heavy green tweed, warm enough for the Iowa winters, and though it did not really fit me, I was very glad to have it and wear it through till spring. That it had been Paul's gave it, to my mind, a certain distinction that more than made up for the poor fit.
To me, Paul was the boss man in the World War II barracks building, which housed both the workshop office and its classes. Donald Justice was on the job as poet-teacher, while Paul raced to and fro within and without the university, playing scout, host, diplomat, advisor, and fundraiser, as well as, when he had a chance to sit down, teacher and writer. He seemed indefatigable.
A week or two into the semester, Paul gave a small informal dinner party in his house on Friendly Avenue so that I could become acquainted with other young poets. I understood him to be pointing out the competition, a very happy competition it was to turn out. In the same way, he tried to steer me and the other new student writers into courses at the university taught by professors more or less sympathetic with the workshop, for there were more of his colleagues than there should have been who were not at all sympathetic and who were, not to mince words, Paul's enemies and by extension ours. It was told that one of Paul's colleagues on the way home from Saturday ball games would stop in the street emboldened by drink and shout out taunts and curses at the writer's workshop.
And yet Paul Engel's career also gives pause, much as I admired what he accomplished setting up the workshop. I saw those glowing front-page notices and book reviews when he first appeared in print in the early 1930s, this canny Rhodes Scholar from Cedar Rapids who had been at Oxford and returned to live in Iowa, where his considerable talents were expected to grow, but had they? He seemed nowhere near other poets in accomplishment, or was it fashion that had changed? And did he do too much well-paid journalism for the major slick magazines like Life?
Paul seemed to have a comprehensive filing system in his head for all the writers who were just then beginning to migrate through the workshop at Iowa, and it's not surprising how he now and then got the details wrong. For him, the details, right or wrong, seemed to be fixed for good. But the most important fact was always a judgment, mysteriously arrived at but seldom wrong, about how good the newcomer was likely to turn out to be as a writer.
That brings me back to another part of the Engel legend, which is how he went about the recruiting of students in particular. It was done with letters tirelessly composed at night in an old backyard chicken house, Paul's workplace in Iowa City. The lights were on there far past midnight constantly.
Driven by a sense of urgency, he would personally deliver his letters to the Rock Island Railroad Station every evening. Each night at 12, he drove to the Iowa City Railroad Station to hand over his day's correspondence to the conductor, so that the letters would be mailed the same night in Chicago.
Later, of course, he did more of his recruiting in person while traveling, which must have been one of the things which led to the international writing program.
I never forgot the unnerving fact that many young writers in Iowa City felt equally convinced of their talents and sure of ultimate success. One of my students that year was a man in his 30s with 2 children. He had pulled up stakes from somewhere in the South. His wife was working as a checkout clerk in the Piggly Wiggly grocery store to support them while he devoted himself to his big chance. Alas, the stories he handed in for criticism were embarrassingly second-rate, cliché-ridden, each one worse than the last. In my view, this fellow possessed no literary gifts whatsoever. He was deluding himself, putting his family through a needless ordeal. I tried to be tactful but honest in my appraisal. He was not listening to me. I learned later of a similarly talentless, dogged fiction writer who had sent stories to a leading New York literary agent, rejection after rejection, and the agent had almost decided to go further and say outright that his prospects were nil. It was hopeless. Probably he wouldn't have stopped scribbling anything. In any case, the writer had turned out to be J.D. Salinger.
To us, the money, but more so the community and the focus on writing, made all the difference. Paul kept his focus, and ours, on the individual writer and his or her place in the community of writers. Today's writing programs sometimes resemble stressed-out writers' conferences compared to Paul's version, but of course it was a calmer time. Make no mistake, Paul delighted in our public successes and used them to win funds. But Paul's effect went way beyond the writers he knew personally and aided directly. Even though there were hundreds of us, it was Paul's energy, his robust language, his demand that you listen and see, his unflagging stamina, his inescapable force that opened a door in American colleges and universities through which hundreds of teaching writers and thousands of writing students would pass. There had long been some teaching positions for teachers who also wrote. If they wrote seriously or wrote much, that was acceptable, but only if they held the PhD and walked the walk of scholars. Because of Paul, however, writing programs sprang up all over the country, most of them following the unacademic, energetic model of Iowa's. And university administrators came to see the vitality such programs afford an institution as a whole. The Master of Fine Arts was increasingly accepted as a sufficient teaching credential for a writer, and the wisest administrators came to understand, as Engels, Iowa had all along, that a truly gifted writer needed no degree at all. Those of us who found a salary, a niche, a project, a task, a duty, or a calling within the university, expressly because we were writers, owe to Paul Engel the core of our lives. He did it. He made it possible. In the beginning, no one gave him permission. The university sometimes supported him, but sometimes, especially at the beginning, merely tolerated him.
Over the years, the Writers' Workshop and its graduates have engendered more than their share of both praise and criticism.